Alright, sweet.
Hey guys, 大家好，大家好，欢迎，欢迎. Welcome to GCC Waterloo's first ever guest speaker event, and I'm super stoked because we got Sarah Eaton here, and Sarah Eaton's a first year poli-sci professor, had her last term in my political economy, Chinese economy class, and she introduced me to Lieberthal. Enough said. What else can I say? Like my last speech, my presentation on succession to Chinese elite politics, mostly based off Lieberthal. That wouldn't happen without Sarah. So without further ado, let's give it for Sarah Eaton, everybody. Oh yeah.
Okay, well thanks, Rob. I'm really happy to meet you guys. I'm excited to hear about this organization. I think it's great. And to tell you a little bit about my research and to have a conversation with you guys about it. The topic of my major research is a bit narrow. It has to do with industrial policy in China. May not be of interest to all of you. I do have interest beyond industrial policy. I've done some work on the implementation of environmental policy in China. So Rob suggested to me that might be more up some of your alleys. So if we want to talk about environmental policy in China, by all means we can do that in QA, and a host of other issues as well. Yeah, so I'm a political science professor here at Waterloo, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my major research, which I've called many different names over the years, and this is my current working title. So this was, to give you some background, my dissertation research. I lived in China from about 2007 to 2011, and that's doing my dissertation. And this is the bulk of that work, and I'm now currently in the process of publishing it in various forms. I have a couple of articles out on this topic, and in the process of turning it into a book, which is a big, long struggle. So very happy to be here and to chat with you guys about this. And if at any point anything's unclear, interrupt me, stop me, we can talk about it. This is not a formal thing, so we should all be relaxed about this. Okay, so this word here, advancing state, is important. And those of you who are Chinese speakers will know what this is a reference to. Essentially, in recent years, especially since the global financial crisis, this phrase, 国进民退, the advance of the state, retreat of the private sector, has become really prominent in the Chinese sort of media world, and when you have conversations with people, often this comes up in daily life. And essentially what this advance of the state, retreat of the private sector refers to is a couple of things that happened after the global financial crisis, centered in around 2009, having to do with, one, a series of high-profile takeovers, corporate takeovers, by large SOEs of smaller private enterprises. This happened in steel, it happened in airlines, it happened in various industries. And this got people, this was kind of a new thing. We hadn't seen this before. And we'll get to why this was a bit of a surprise. So that was one sort of element of 国进民退, of this advance of the state retreat of the private sector. Another element was in 2009, the Chinese government rolled out a big fiscal stimulus plan, as other governments elsewhere in the world did. In China, this fiscal stimulus plan was weighted very much towards the state sector, towards large state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and this sort of generated debate about what was going on here. And again, this was kind of a new thing. And again, so the sort of periodization of this trend goes back to 2008, 2009, but it's still very much on people's minds. And essentially, so my work at the broadest level examines this trend. Where did it come from? Why did it happen? And the major sort of conclusion that I come to in this work is that it's a much longer-term process than most people would suggest. So in fact, it predates 2008 by a couple of decades in terms of the questions that I'm interested in. So it's a longer-term legacy. And the particular aspects of the advance of the state that I'm interested in are here, this latter part of the slide here, referring to industrial policy, which is aimed at building up large state-owned enterprises in key sectors. So that's kind of what this advance of the state business is all about. And in the field that I'm in Chinese political economy, people have noticed that this advance of the state is taking place, and it's caused them to ask a few questions about where China more broadly is headed. And I would argue that the sort of conventional view of Chinese economic reform since 1978, when Deng Xiaoping takes the wheel, is of a gradual retreat of the state. This was a kind of marketization in slower motion than we saw in the other post-Soviet states in Eastern Europe. And if you were looking for evidence that this was true, there were various places to look. One of them is in the large-scale privatization of the state sector, a reform called letting go of the small and grabbing the large, 抓大放小, starting from the late 1990s. What we're looking at here is some figures on the extent of this privatization. So we saw big privatization of SOEs at local levels, but the grabbing the large part of this reform refers to the bottom half of the screen. And essentially what the state did is keep hold of the large SOEs under control of the central government. And that's really important for the questions that I'm interested in. But nevertheless, this privatization was really significant. We had this large-scale privatization. We had also, in the post-1978 period, a big flourishing of private or at least non-state entrepreneurship. So the non-state sector is the biggest employer in the Chinese economy, big generator of profits and economic activity, of course. If you were looking for more evidence of the gradual retreat of the state, you wouldn't have to look much further than China's WTO entry in 2001. Many of you probably won't remember this event, but it was a momentous event, partly because China's entry into the WTO took place on very arduous, very difficult terms. They had to agree to opening some very sensitive sectors, including finance, including agriculture. So after China's entry into the WTO in 2001, big banks had what's called national treatment in the domestic market. So this seemed to me more evidence of the state retreating from the market. The advance of the state in the last couple of years has caused people to rethink where China's heading and where in fact it's been in the past. One of the sort of measures of how things have changed has to do with the wealth and influence of what some people refer to as the state-owned enterprise national team, or the 国家队. These figures are now a little bit out of date, but they tell you the story of a big change in the finances of the state sector over the last decade. So prior to 2001, in the 1990s and the 1980s, the state-owned sector, SOEs, were a big, big problem for Chinese policymakers. They were perennially losing money. They were a big drain on the state's finances. So hence we see this privatization that we've just talked about. They were a big, in essence, sort of drag on the neck of policymakers. They never knew quite what to do. And then suddenly, in the first decade of the 2000s, many of these large SOEs that were left over from this reform, this privatization reform, suddenly started making money. And they started to make a lot of money. So, and this tells you who's making the money in the 2001 to 2007 period. It was first and foremost central SOEs, Yangqi, under the control of the central government. And much of these profits that these SOEs were generating were retained within the enterprises themselves. That is, they didn't hand over many of the profits to the government itself. And that's what that top part of the screen tells you. This is changing slowly over time. So they're wealthy, they're also influential. Those of you like Rob who follow elite politics very closely in China will know that many of the CEOs of these large SOEs on the national team, there are about 100 of them, give or take, are members of the Central Committee or alternate members of the Central Committee, or have very, very close ties to powerful families in the Communist Party. So they also exert incredible amounts of influence on Chinese politics. Also, with regard to this flourishing private sector, well, this advance of the state trend sort of brought attention to the fact that many of these private enterprises are outside of the most lucrative sectors. So this word here means monopoly, and this is a big SOE on the inside, eating the meat in lucrative sectors like telecommunications. And these are some very sad-looking private enterprises trying to break down this monopoly and get to where the profits are. But these high administrative barriers to entry, which the government maintains to protect these SOEs, are seen as one source of the big SOEs' profits. So the private sector is relegated to the least profitable sectors of the economy. They're eating the soup while state enterprises are eating the meat. They're drinking the soup, rather. Also, in regards to this question of what WTO actually means, well, we're now 11 years past China's WTO entry, and many bankers, foreign bankers, will tell you that they're a little bit disappointed by the market access that they actually have in some of these sectors. So in the sort of implementation of China's WTO commitments, there's been some disappointment in how far they actually go. So this question of the advance of the state generates some questions for those of us who spend our time thinking about the Chinese politics and Chinese economy and kind of where things are heading. And one of the hypotheses about what's going on here, why we see the advance of the state, draws on a big tradition in political economy, which directs our attention to the nature of powerful interests in driving economic decision making. And I think this is a real nice, succinct statement of this particular view by a very famous economist, a guy named Wu Jinglian. He wrote this op-ed in Caijing in 2009. The Chinese economy at 60 years, he got in some trouble for writing this op-ed. He's known as a kind of speak your mind fellow, but he did lose some friends over this editorial, and he lost some friends primarily over this passage here. And what he's essentially telling us is that in the early period of reform after 1978, the benefits of reform were distributed very, very widely. And he argues that now, in the current phase of reform, roughly from 2000 forward, the state-owned monopolies and government departments have been primarily enjoying the fruits of reform, and further reform will harm their interests. So Wu Jinglian's view is essentially that reform has stalled in China, and it's stalled precisely because of these powerful interests who are kind of blocking the way. And just from conversations with people following these issues in China, there's a lot of sort of sympathy for this view. There's a lot of people who feel the same way, that these powerful interests are now standing in the way of future reforms. So interests is one way of looking at this. I think that we also have to pay attention to the sort of set of ideas which are behind this advance of the state. And this draws our attention to another group of scholars who would argue that, in fact, the way that Chinese policymakers, regulators, think about the market itself is incredibly important to what we see happening. So these two thinkers that I highlight in this section called market vision here really draw attention to the fact that policymakers in China never bought fully into this neoliberal notion of the virtues of the self-regulating market. And they always believed that in some kinds of sectors, especially the strategic sectors in which we see large SOEs playing the dominant role today, that the state must in fact manage this competition. They can't be left to their own devices. The state must play a role in managing competition. And what that means in practice is that in many of these sectors that we're talking about, there are about 10, includes telecommunications, airlines, shipping, oil, banking, finance. There are usually 3 or 4 large state-owned enterprises which together form an oligopoly, and the regulatory bodies in these industries play a very prominent role in managing competition. So they try and engineer the market so that profits are roughly divided between the 3 or 4 players in the market. They're not left to their own devices at all. Another sort of driver in terms of this notion of ideas has to do with the nature of global markets. So this fellow, Peter Nolan, draws attention to the fact that Chinese policymakers, before they entered WTO, were really worried about Chinese enterprises' ability to compete with global behemoths like Microsoft, like GE, in big global markets. And they felt that in order for Chinese companies to compete, they'd have to make them big first. So there's this famous phrase in China called 做大做强. It means to go big and go strong into international markets. And that's the kind of logic of industrial policy that does that. So the questions that my research really examines are in the industries that we're talking about here, this handful of industries that I've mentioned, to what extent do we see interests and to what extent do we see ideas as causing these changes? And one of the findings of my research is that there was, this is a little bit simplistic, but there was a real important shift in Chinese reform, in the Chinese reform period. So in the 1978 to 1989 period, we have two fellows here who are very important. Who's this here? Deng Xiaoping, yes, and who's this here? Zhao Ziyang, yeah. And Wen Jiabao, yeah, exactly. Interesting photo, huh? And after the Tiananmen uprising in June 1989, Zhao Ziyang was out. And for a very brief period, these two fellows were very influential in policy. Who's this here? Li Peng, and who's this here? Chen Yun. Yeah. So Chen Yun was a very old man by this time, but Li Peng was seen as part of his faction, in the same way that Zhao Ziyang, who was premier and general secretary, was seen as part of Deng Xiaoping's faction. And in this brief period between 1989 and 1982, when the reformers who were associated with Deng Xiaoping sort of took back the reins from Li Peng and Chen Yun's group, in this brief period, 3-year period, the reformers did a very good job of sort of implanting their view of where China should be going on economic policy. And one of the kind of legacies of this period of reform is the focus of my research. And it's called the large enterprise strategy. And the large enterprise strategy was essentially about building, through industrial policy measures, large enterprises in the state-owned sector. And it corresponds, when you look at the archival evidence, I spent a lot of time doing this, and also interviewing people who were in policy positions at that time, you find that this post-Tiananmen period, this 1989 to 1992 period, was very, very crucial in providing the sort of receptive environment for this large enterprise strategy, this industrial policy to take root. And I won't take you through the details of this, but there were interesting things that happened. So in the aftermath of the Tiananmen period, Jiang Zemin takes the reins, and he says very, very quickly, we must do everything possible to revitalize large and medium-sized SOEs. They are the backbone and foundation of our socialist economy. And this statement really reflected the conservatives' view that Deng and Zhao Ziyang had gone too far in allowing the non-state sector to expand in over the 1980s. And what they were worried about, one was the legitimacy of a communist state, right? What's the end game here? If the private sector expands to the point to which there is no state sector, how can we call ourselves socialists, right? So there was a sort of ideology, legitimacy issue in play there. Also, a kind of more prosaic power question, which is how do we, as the rulers as the authoritarian rulers of a communist state, maintain control of the important dimensions in the economy? So that's kind of what's at issue in Jiang Zemin's statement. And also in this period, this fellow Mao Hong, who was really the entrepreneur, the guy behind this idea of the large enterprise strategy, comes out and says publicly that Zhao Ziyang really did a disservice to these large state-owned enterprises, and he gave too much preference to these things called township and village enterprises, which belong to the non-state sector. So this really reflects the extent to which thinking in Beijing changed about where emphasis should fall. And over the period of the 1990s, this emphasis on building up large SOEs, both for the sake of the national economy and also for the sake of pushing Chinese enterprises into global markets, really took hold and grew. So there was various initiatives which were based on the same premise about the importance of building up these large SOEs. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about how we can see this shift that I'm talking about, this turn, in one particular industry that belongs to this small group of strategic sectors, and that's airlines, which I've spent a lot of time looking at. And we can see this turn reflected really well in the development of industrial reform in this industry. So in the Dung years, in the early period of reform, there were quite radical reforms that took place in the airlines industry. There was encouragement for startup airlines, and later, actually after the Dung years, there was a very aggressive experiment in price deregulation, so the regulators let go of control of prices. And then we see at the end of the 1990s, as this big SOE industrial policy regime is building up, we see this very dramatic policy reversal. We see the re-regulation of prices, and finally the state decides to take control of the market entirely and create, by administrative fiat, three big SOEs, three big state-owned airlines. So essentially they got all of the players in the market together and arbitrarily pushed together, I take two small airlines and I lump it in with this big state-owned airline. I take these other two small private airlines and I lump it in with this airline. And the end result of the process was three even bigger, big three state-owned carriers. We're talking here about Air China, China Southern, and China Eastern. And it's really from this period of the late 1990s that we see this managed competition norm as really accepted as really the sort of MO for the industry. And I kind of like this chart. It shows the way that market share really shifted over this period. So we're talking again about the market share of these big three state-owned airlines, which the state was trying to build up through these various measures towards the end of the 1990s. And in this period of deregulation, it sort of cuts into their market share, and then the state's getting worried, and re-regulation begins. And then finally, this administrative consolidation, which I talked about, where these various carriers were arbitrarily pushed together, really pushed the market share of these three state-owned airlines back up to above the level it was at prior to the beginning of these reforms. So why am I talking to you about this? Well, I think it tells us the close examination of what actually happened, what actually drove this decision to re-regulate and then finally to consolidate the market. When we look carefully at the archival record, as well as when we interview people about the subject, what we find out is that there were these two dimensions. The interest in the ideas, which I talked about earlier, both of them are very present. So in terms of this ideational sort of aspect, around this time of the dramatic reforms, regulators were talking about the need to create big carriers to compete in global markets with Uniteds and with the Lufthansas of the world. Again, this same logic that Chinese enterprises had to get big in preparation for WTO entry and various other liberalizing measures. And this is very, very clear when you look at the archives. And second, but it wasn't just ideas. There were also big interests in play here. And in fact, these big interests, primarily the big three, were very skillful at using the cover of ideas to sort of to advance their interests. So the small airlines, very unsurprisingly, in this policy debate, advocated for more marketization, less state control, and the big three said, no, we need oligopoly in order to compete in global markets. And finally, the big three won out, and that's what happened. So sort of stepping back from the particular case of airlines, I think airlines is just one industry in China, but in fact we see this trend of the move to oligopoly and the creation of these kind of 3 SOE markets in many of the big strategic sectors in the late 1990s. So there was something going on there, not just in airlines. And I think this perspective, which looks not only at the interests of the SOEs, but also about what people believed about how the state should manage the market, we need to pay attention to both of these things when we try to understand why the state is advancing. And again, my sort of biggest, I hope, takeaway point from my examination of this question of the advance of the state in China is that it didn't start in 2008. No, it started really in the post-Tiananmen period with all of these industrial policy measures which were aimed at building up large SOEs. So I hope I haven't bored you guys to death. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this or related topics to do with China.
I guess I'll start off with a question. Do you think it was necessary for them to do that? Because they're entering the WTO, and then there is increased competition, right? Now all these other foreign companies have access to China. Was it a good move?
Yeah. It's a very good question. In my political economy class that Brad's in, we've been talking about whether living in a globalized world requires that states use some form of industrial policy to adapt. And I think to some degree this notion that Chinese enterprises have to be big in order to be strong in international markets is absolutely true, right? And when you look at the market share of many markets, you see that accounting is just the one that leaped off in my head, that big Western companies command a lion's share of the market. They're very concentrated, heavily concentrated markets. So this notion that getting big is important to getting strong is of course important. What's more difficult is when you look at how these how the large enterprise strategy, which I've been focusing on, actually played out. There was a lot of politics involved in it, and a lot of kind of arbitrary, again, pushing together relatively successful enterprises with kind of laggard enterprises, and the result of that is that you don't get a very good, the result of those kinds of mergers never work out very well. And that's been more the rule than the exception, that when the state has played a role in pushing together various enterprises in order to create some big behemoth, large enterprise, there's been a lot of problems along the way. So the devil is in the details. Did that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
How exactly is this different from like other like nations? Like I know like in Korea they have like the Hyundai group.
Yeah, yeah.
And like there's all these groups. How does the Chinese like differ because everyone wants to get big and have a huge market share. But,
Yeah, yeah.
How is this different?
Yeah. That's a great question. And one of the things that I've learned from looking at archives and stuff is that in the 80s and the 90s, especially in this period that I'm interested in, this 89-92 period, there were lots of study groups that were sent to Korea, to Japan, to figure out how the developmental state had created these big enterprises in those places. To answer your question, what's different about the large enterprises that China's made as compared to Korea? Well, they're state-owned, and that makes a big difference. They're state-owned, so, this is a very kind of complicated question, but when these big SOEs were created out of the old kind of hulks of the command economy, they didn't have any sort of sense of what it is that firms do. They kind of had to learn the profit motive, and they had a lot of problems with getting rid of surplus workers and trying to stimulate productivity, right? So they had to learn kind of managerial competence. And to this day, most of these big SOEs, these winners that the state has picked, haven't learned that competence very well. There are some exceptions. For example, in telecommunications, China Mobile is seen as an SOE that's kind of absorbed the capitalist ethos. But many of these old SOEs that go back to the command economy nowadays are just, haven't changed all that radically.